because in the real world, most psychopaths get found out pretty quickly. You can screw somebody once and maybe twice, but then they figure it out and then word gets around. And so in the real world, two things happen. Psychopaths have to be itinerant so they can find new people to exploit. And the other thing that happens is generally non-psychopathic males who are fairly aggressive keep the psychopaths under control.
It's 2050 and you find yourself in prison, not because you committed murder, attempted murder, sexual assault, credit card fraud, tax evasion, etc. You can't figure out why you're here. You pace in yourself frantically, thinking about what you could have possibly done to be locked up. You didn't even get your day in court. Just straight to prison you went. You reflect knowing you haven't been the best of a person. You have a bit of a temper, you're a bit impulsive, you promised you'd pay back your parents months ago, but you haven't actually committed a crime. This all started because of one man many, many years ago. Let's rewind to 2018. This is Joseph James DeAngelo, an American serial killer, sex offender, burglar, and former police officer, yes, police officer, who committed at least 13 murders, 51 rapes, 120 burglaries across California between 1974 and 1986.
Hey, Paul!
Although in 1974 we couldn't tell he would go on to commit hundreds of crimes, how he was caught through seemingly innocent new technology opens a floodgate to find more and more criminals just like him, and maybe just catch criminals before they strike again. You might be thinking, this is great, right? Being able to convict a criminal to a life sentence behind bars for a heinous crime, where you no longer need traditional means of investigation, but you simply only need a DNA test of the criminal's cousins, brothers, aunts, sisters, or any relative to whom the criminal is related to. You see, due to breakthroughs in DNA technology, the FBI was able to match the DNA on the crime scene not to the criminal's DNA, but to the relatives of the criminal thanks to new and developing DNA databases from companies like Ancestry and 23andMe. They found out who his family was through DNA technology and narrowed it down to one man, him. This is a breakthrough in finding and arresting criminals that had evaded the law for years and even decades, and all it takes is someone in your family using 23andMe or Ancestry to innocently check their genetic lineage. So what does this have to do with you? You're not connected to him, you're not family, you're completely innocent. Well, it turns out as the years went on, due to more breakthroughs, not only can we find serial killers through their relatives' DNA, but we can find genetic patterns among these serial killers. These patterns will become crucial in the future, especially the future you find yourself in. You see, in this future, seemingly innocent companies like 23andMe and Ancestry teamed up with researchers and government agencies to document and study, let's just say, certain genes and mutations. First, they started with the incarcerated, looking for any commonalities in their DNA, and believe me, they exist. They look for the genes and mutations that occur in their most violent, narcissistic, and antisocial of inmates. Next, they started testing members of our armed forces, looking for those same genes and mutations. Next was troubled teens and young adults, looking for the same genes. Soon they started testing the general public. Too many people with these genes and mutations find themselves getting in trouble with the law at one point or another. They're too violent, antisocial, narcissistic to participate in society. Eventually, this leads to crime prevention. All it takes is one charismatic leader to simply ask, why not monitor or arrest those who are flagged in their system as having all these wrong genes and mutations? What about those who have the same genes and mutations as psychopaths, but are outside of prison? Should they be allowed to run free and participate in society? That's where you find yourself. You see, due to unfortunate circumstances, you carry these genes and mutations. So it no longer matters if you committed a crime. All that matters is you were going to, and apparently didn't even know it. So you're locked up and taken away from society. How does that sound? If you want to skip ahead to see what genes and mutations are linked to psychopaths, you're more than welcome to. I have this video time punched for that reason. I think the 2002 film Minority Report proves my point perfectly. It's an action detective thriller set in Washington, D.C. in the year 2054, where police utilize a sort of psychic technology to arrest and convict murderers before they commit their crime. Tom Cruise plays a head of this pre-crime unit and is himself accused of the future murder of a man he hasn't even met.
Look at me. Positive for Howard Marks. I'm placing you under arrest for the future murder of Sarah Marks and Donald Dubin that was take place today, April 22nd, at 0800 hours and 4 minutes.
This is more or less exactly the reality you find yourself in. You can also thank one other man too. Let's rewind again. No, not him. This, right here. This is James Fallon, this guy. All of this will make sense in just a minute. Just hang in there with me. He studies brains. More specifically, his research interests include adult stem cells, chemical neuroanatomy, and circuitry, higher brain functions, and brain imaging. He spent a lot of time studying the brains of convicted criminals and the mentally ill, hoping to uncover who among them is a psychopath and gain new insights into how their brains work. He authored a book on psychopaths that goes over a lot of the genes and mutations found in psychopaths and their PET scans. If you don't know what that is, it's a brain scan. And it will teach you what a psychopath really is, if you are one or have overlapping traits, as well as unique DNA that makes up a psychopath. His book and plenty of research shows a common thread among psychopaths or borderline psychopaths. What common genes they have, their mutations, their PET scans of their brains. And this is why you're in prison, because you flagged the future crime institution system as having just the right genes and mutations. I'm sure you have a lot of questions about free will, morality, and the ethics of using advanced technology to predict and prevent crime, but I want to focus on the genetics of psychopaths. Exactly what is it in psychopaths' DNA that we could one day use to find more of them and potentially arrest them under the rationale of preventing future crime? If you want to read through the studies, they are in the description. Just a disclaimer, antisocial does not mean introverted. It actually has a completely different meaning in psychology. To kind of summarize, it usually means to be hostile or harmful to organized society, to kind of lack empathy or view humans as objects instead of, well, humans. The MAOA gene, or also known as the warrior gene. Warrior genes are usually turned on from abuse at an early age or in the womb when the mother is under considerable stress. I found a lot, and I mean a lot, of studies on this gene. Here's just some of them in case you're interested. You can pause and read them. I also link them all in the video description. Some studies have suggested that variations in the MAOA gene, which is the warrior gene, is involved in the metabolism of neurotransmitters such as serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. They are strongly linked to narcissistic and especially antisocial behavior. Multiple studies found that individuals with a specific variant of the MAOA gene, known as the low activity variant, were more likely to display aggressive and antisocial behavior. This variant is associated with lower levels of MAOA activity, which means there's less breakdown of the neurotransmitters mentioned earlier, leading to higher levels in the brain. It is suggested that the higher levels of these neurotransmitters in individuals with the low activity variant may contribute to impulsive and aggressive behavior, drug abuse, alcoholism, sexual assault, etc. Studies have also found that individuals with this variant have a high risk of developing conduct disorder, a condition characterized by persistent antisocial behavior and a higher risk of developing antisocial personality disorder later in adulthood. Another study also found a link between the warrior gene and antisocial behavior in men, but not women. Oddly enough, there is a study associating the warrior gene with aggression in men, but somehow happiness in women. Studies have shown that the warrior gene is not the only factor contributing to antisocial behavior, and other genetic and environmental factors also play a role. In summary, research has suggested that variations in the warrior gene are linked to antisocial behavior, particularly the low activity variant, but it is only one of many factors that contribute to the development of antisocial behavior, and it is not a definitive indicator of it. You can get tested to see if you have the warrior gene as well as what variant. There is also the CDH13 gene, and it's often linked with the warrior gene. I found, albeit not very strong, studies that have suggested that a variation in the gene encoding cadherin 13, that is the CDH13 gene, may be associated with the increased risk of impulsive and aggressive behavior. One study published in the American Journal of Medical Genetics in 2010 found a possible association between specific variations of the CDH13 gene and impulsiveness and antisocial behavior in a sample of individuals with a history of criminal behavior. It seems to amplify the warrior gene when coupled with it. Studies link this gene with autism, ADHD, bipolar, and schizophrenia, and impulsive behavior. Couple that with a warrior gene, and you can already see how that could be a problem. Another one that completely caught me off guard was oxytocin, known as the love chemical. So what exactly does this have to do with psychopaths? Do they just not feel any affection or love? Turns out there's a oxytocin polymorphism. For those of you that don't know, polymorphisms are just more or less, think of it as a cluster of mutations. So the oxytocin receptor has variants, aka polymorphisms, and they are fairly common and linked to social personality traits, including introversion and empathy. There was a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is just a bunch of studies being put together to try to draw insights. And the meta-analysis combined data from 12 studies, and it found several genetic variations of the OXTR gene linked to antisocial behavior. Variants of this gene have been linked in many studies to be more likely to have antisocial behavior, more likely to have callous, unemotional traits, not be as empathetic, more likely to have sociopathic traits. This was a total surprise. I have a ton of studies. Feel free to pause at any time and look through them. As I said before, they are located in the description. Another gene was the 5-HTTL-PR. Multiple studies found that individuals with a specific variation of this gene, which is involved in the regulation of serotonin, were more likely to score high on measurements of narcissism and antisocial behavior. This variant is associated with low levels of serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter that plays a role in regulating mood and social behavior. For example, a study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 2002 found that individuals with a specific variation of the 5-HTTL-PR gene and the S allele were more likely to exhibit impulsive and antisocial behavior. It has been linked to a wide variety of illnesses, including eating disorders, depression, personality disorders, autism, bipolar, schizophrenia, etc. Next is DRD4 or DRD2. I found a lot of studies showing both of these to have connections with psychopathic traits. So studies found a link between the DRD4 gene, which is involved in the regulation of dopamine, and antisocial traits. Individuals with a 7R allele of this gene were more likely to score high on measures of antisocial behavior. This allele is associated with a higher sensitivity to reward and a higher level of impulsivity. The DRD4 gene has been investigated as a potential contributor to the development of psychopathy. For example, a study published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology in the year 2000 found that individuals with a specific variation of the DRD4 gene were more likely to exhibit impulsive and antisocial behavior. Another study published in the Journal of Psychiatric Research in 2007 found that individuals with the R7 allele of the DRD4 gene were more likely to score higher on measurements of psychopathy as well, including impulsiveness and antisocial behavior. Next is DAT1 gene. I didn't find many studies on this, but this gene has been linked to aggressive, hostile, and antisocial behavior, as well as ADHD. It has been commonly found in people with conduct disorder as well. Next is a LINC00951 gene. It encodes a long coding RNA region processed in the brain's prefrontal cortex. The function of this gene isn't fully understood. It turns out a genetic variation of this gene, the RS4714329, was identified in a genome-wide association study of criminal offenders with antisocial personality disorder. This variant increases the relative risk of antisocial personality disorder diagnoses in the prisoners by 59%. The risk allele is also associated with antisocial features in non-criminal adults, but only if they had severe problems, aka things like trauma and abuse in childhood. Next is the SIRT1 gene. I was only able to find one study on this gene. The present study is the first to report a significant association between the SIRT1 gene polymorphism and antisocial personality in adolescents. This finding is expected to aid in the development of effective interventions for this socially and personally costly disorder. Next is HTR2B. This gene mutation, found almost exclusively in people with Finnish ancestry, has strong links to aggression, impulsiveness, and antisocial personality disorder. Next is the SNAP25 gene. This gene is found very commonly in males with antisocial personality disorder compared to women, and is also more common in people with ADHD. Furthermore, I wanted to kind of touch on some of the environmental factors. So, pregnant mothers and people coming from broken families should kind of feel like a good place to start. Many studies pointed to the mother being put under a lot of stress while pregnant causes the child to have behavioral problems and act more violently, and this shows up as early as like 2 years of age. Another study found that mothers who smoke while pregnant have kids who show higher rates of antisocial behavior too. Lastly, here is a study, if you want to look over it, going over a meta-analysis of genes that they believe contribute to psychopathy. So this whole website has a bunch of genetics linked to psychopaths as well as the studies. One thing you will find on here that's very interesting is look where this came from. So these companies already have data on these genes and exactly what they are linked to or what they cause. So you can already see how a database for people who are psychopaths could easily be formed in secrecy, maybe. It's not like the FBI or CIA hasn't been caught doing stuff of this nature before. So yeah, right here, this gene right here. And if you take the 23andMe or Ancestry DNA test, you can actually see if you have this gene, and then boom, you click on this and you get the study connected to it. So right away, we can already see how all this information could be used for a more or less like pre-crime division. If you have one of these, maybe, you can be let off the hook. But what if you have all these mutations? What's stopping someone from deciding that you should be locked up because you're just simply too high risk to allow to run free? So what is stopping the government from taking all these genes from people who have innocently done studies on Ancestry and 23andMe and start to monitor people with these genes? Just the first step, maybe not arrest them, but just monitor them. There is just one big catch though. The gentleman I mentioned earlier, James Fallon, is, well, I want to show you this.
My book, The Psychopath Inside, is a memoir, and it's a mix of a personal story and what the science is, that is the psychiatry and the genetics and the neuroscience behind what the subject is, which is psychopathy. But it's really a story about somebody, me, who at 60 finds out he's not really who he thought he was all along in his whole life. And not until I had, just by serendipity, by chance, started to run across biological evidence, first from PET scans, positron emission tomography scans, that I was involved with. I acted as a control in one study in Alzheimer's disease. And
if you haven't read this book, it will blow your mind with how candid he is. As you can guess by the title, James Fallon is a psychopath. However, he hasn't committed any crimes. He has a lot of these genetic mutations. Feel free to find any video of him on YouTube or read his book. So it begs the question, he is a neuroscientist. He has done a lot of good for society. Should he be locked up? Or does this system need to be more refined before we even think about implementing it? On top of that, if a system like this is implemented, a lot of people in government probably have these traits. So who's to say they wouldn't exempt themselves?